The Lord be with you. Let us pray. I invite you to join me in saying our prayer for this morning. God of blooming garden and the fallow field, the lively and the dormant, give us the trust, insight, and perspective we need to walk with you each day, through the troughs as well as the peaks. Remind us how valuable the troughs can be. Help us set aside the immediate players, the business as usual that creates distance from you. Keep us humble, joyful, and vibrant. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So this week, we're going to talk about peaks and valleys as the prayer signaled. But before I get to that, I want to go back and see if you had any revelations during the week that you want to share. We talked last week about taking up our cross, about focusing on the suffering that was right in front of us and consciously taking up what was unavoidable. We talked about experimenting with letting go of self-absorption by serving others with courageous generosity, i.e., getting out of your own down by doing something for someone else. I'm wondering if you had any conscious moments of that this week that you want to share. Did you notice anything, having received the enlightenment of that wisdom last Sunday? All right. It's Lent. Guilt is part of my agenda. All right. So I want to remind you that we are spending our Lent with several characters, and I mean that. Screwtape is one of them. He is the undersecretary of the infernal lowerarchy. He's a highly experienced devil. He is instructing his nephew, Wormwood, in the art of temptation. Wormwood is trying to turn a young human called the patient away from God, called the enemy, and toward the dark side. We have a new character this week, Slubgob. Slubgob is the head of the training college for young tempters. Screwtape portrays him as predictably inept, churning out incompetent young demons, of which Wormwood is one. And I'm kind of building an implied anthropology. That is, although C.S. Lewis isn't explicit about it in his letters, and you hear him talk about how the devil is tempting us away from God, you begin to get a sense of who he thinks we really are. He doesn't say, here's what I think humans are, here's what I think a self is, but you get a sense of it, so I'm going to kind of track it as we go along. The first point is that humans are fundamentally good. Humans are fundamentally good. Some of you who are of a certain age will remember when to apply for a job you had to take a personality test of some sort. And one of the questions used to be, do you believe humans are fundamentally good or fundamentally bad? I always wondered how they answered that question. Not the applicants, but the employers. Maybe you still ask it, I don't know. Anyway, Screwtape says they're basically good, which is a problem for him, of course. The key, he thinks, is to realize that every choice humans make draws them closer to or pushes them further away from God. Every choice, no matter how pedestrian or grand, draws us toward or pushes us further from God. And the trick is to persuade humans to look at things in a way that prevents them from realizing that they're making a choice at all. Increasingly, I think you'll see this theme emerging, that the real subtle art that Screwtape is attempting to school Wormwood in is deflection, is deferring, is persuading humans they don't have to make a choice at all. In an early letter, remember, the patient was about to come upon some great insight, and Screwtape said, you don't have to persuade him it's wrong, just persuade him it's time to go to lunch. Remember that? You don't have to persuade him it's wrong. It's just time to go to lunch. You'll see this happen over and over again. And the anthropology there is that God provides the joy in our life. We can't really make that happen all by ourselves. We can only open ourselves to it. However, we can screw it up. We can get in the way of that joy in our own pursuit of happiness. And so it's those decisions that Screwtape is trying to encourage. All right, this week we're going to talk about Jesus in the temple. Next time somebody tells you Jesus is nice, I want you to remember this image of him. Halo intact, but weapon assembled, and nobody thinks he's being nice at the moment. He is, of course, running the money changers and the traders from the temple. So this is set forth in John, early in John, and we've got 3 different segments of scripture I want to read this morning. I would love someone to please to read this first one.
The Passover of Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple he found people selling cattle, sheep, and doves, and the money changers seated at their tables. Making a whip of cords, he drove all of them out of the temple, both the sheep and the cattle. He also poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables.
And somebody to read this one, please.
He told those who were selling the doves, "Take these things out of here. Stop making my Father's house a market place." The disciples remember that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." The Jews then said to him, "What sign can you show us for doing this?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "This temple has been under construction for 46 years, and you will raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking of the temple of his body.
And the last section.
After he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered he said this, and they believed the scripture and the word that Jesus spoke.
The word of the Lord. Now, what the context I want to provide you for this famous story is that he is in fact channeling the spirit of a prophet, and that prophet is Zechariah. Zechariah was prophesying as the Jews who'd been exiled to Babylon were being allowed to return to Jerusalem. The Persians had conquered the Babylonians, and Cyrus was going to set them free to the extent they could come back to Jerusalem, albeit still under Persian control. Zechariah is calling people back to God-centered community after their return. He is calling for the reconstruction of the temple, but he has a vision of what the new temple will be like. And he alludes at the coming Messiah and the peace that he will bring. He alludes to that image. So Zechariah is calling them back from Babylon, back to the reconstruction of the new temple, but he's got an image of what that will look like and how present God will be to the people and people will be to God. And here's what he says. You look at the very last verse there. There'll no longer be traitors in the house of the Lord of hosts on that day. There'll no longer be traitors. So Jesus just didn't look at the traitors and decide that he didn't like them. There was something deeper going on. He is channeling the spirit of the prophet, which presumably people would have known. But that, I think, raises an interesting question. Why do you think Jesus was so angry? Why was he mad at them and so passionate about their removal?
Because they were making the people pay exorbitant fees to change their money into the prescribed temple money.
So they were making people pay exorbitant fees. They were profiting from the people, perhaps unethically or immorally. Could there be another reason? That's right, in the minds of most. Is there another reason that might also be right? Had to pay to come in at all, however fair it might have been. It was the house of the Lord. Why not?
Not the place for that activity.
Why were they there?
Making money on someone else.
But it was a sacrificial system, though, right? The idea was only what God would sacrifice to God had to be perfect. So better to travel to Jerusalem and buy a perfect pigeon than to bring your own and have it rejected when you got there. So they're there providing a service, which may have been seen by some as being necessary in order to present yourself to God in the appropriate way. The sacrificial system had been the purpose of the temple at the beginning, right? So I'm asking you to be charitable. Not that any of these answers are wrong, but what is a charitable reading of what the traders were doing? Was there ever a reason for it? Or was it always just evil? Yeah. The idea that you could gain forgiveness or paying for it, kind of manipulating God in that way. That Jesus would be saying that's not an appropriate view of God. Yeah. What else? These are all great answers, thank you. What I want you to remember is there's a lot going on here. And it could include all of these or none of these, we don't really know why Jesus felt the way he felt any more than we know what he was experiencing when he was in the wilderness, being tempted by the devil. But what we do know, I think, is that if you look at the rest of Jesus' ministry, you can see an effort to make God's relationship with humans and humans' relationship with God more direct and more based on who you are and not just what you did in the context of sacrifice. Does that make sense? So maybe they were cheating them. That would be cause for anger, certainly, and their people, I'm sure they were. Our prices in the bookstore are very reasonable, however. And maybe they didn't want you to buy your access to God, though please be nice to the ushers when they come by during service. But it may also be simply they were controlling access to God in the way the temple was set up to begin with.
You said that they bought from the vendors there rather than bringing their own for fear that it would be rejected. So who made the decision about whether something was a worthy sacrifice for God or not? The priest?
Presumably the priest, right?
They were in cahoots with the vendors, huh?
I mean, my own sense of it, maybe. My own sense of it is this is how things get set up, that you have a way of trying to do the right thing. You develop a system that tries to ensure that right thing is done. The system is populated by people whose sense of greed and selfishness maybe even gets away with it from them before they know it, and pretty soon you got a corrupt system. That's my own sense, yeah.
Just thinking about the question, wouldn't Screwtape say that literally the money changers being there and just performing business is useful and creating the distraction from that relationship with God?
Excellent, yes. Is this not an example of business as usual? Yeah.
Would that not be the same as during the days of Martin Luther, the Catholic having indulgences?
Yeah, what's the difference between being told you have to have a perfect pigeon and paying for an indulgence so your loved one gets out of purgatory? Excellent point, yeah.
I think you said the thing about like the bookstore and us just getting tons of cheap there. But I would say it's part of this, with Jesus just, being, not saying necessarily that they are told that they're doing wrong, but, being disruptive to the system and fall into the way of doing things the same thing. You don't think about it anymore. And it's no longer close to God, whereas by him being angry, showing that emotion, it kind of wakes people up and say, hey, what's going on?
Yeah, look at this a different way, which is that act is a performative act. It's not presumably just a burst of anger. He, like prophets before him, are doing something very noticeable, drawing attention to what's happening in order to force you to look at it in a new way. Yeah, I think these are all very good answers. All I'm saying is we have a tendency, particularly being so far removed from these things, to look at the Pharisees and say, what hypocrites, and dismiss them. Or to look at the money changers in the temple and say they're corrupt and dismiss them. And when we do that, we run the risk of not learning how we are like them. Does that make sense? How are we like them? And I think Screwtape would love that, right? Screwtape would love that. So my plea is just have a charitable reading, although, again, your answers are all right and they're all what people think. But I think we learn the most when we open ourselves the most to self-criticism in that way. Okay, well, there are a number of letters this morning, so whereas in the past I tried to tell you everything was in a letter, in this case I'm simply going to tell you the narrative purpose of the letter and pick one thing to talk about. So if I didn't pick the thing you want to talk about, interrupt me. If you've read the letters and you have your own question, interrupt me. I want to honor that. All right, chapter 8, Troughs and Peaks. In the 8th letter, it's obvious that Screwtape is increasingly annoyed with Wormwood's inexperience and naive enthusiasm. Wormwood's hopes that his patient's religious phase is dying away are quickly dashed by Screwtape's explanation of the law of undulation. The law of undulation, don't you love that? Details of God's master plan for humans and how those plans contrast to Satan's master plans. That's what's happening in that 8th letter. So my question is, have you ever been able to eat your cake and have it too? You ever been able to eat your cake and have it too? The law of undulation says that humans go through cycles, periods of emotional and bodily richness and liveliness, which alternate with periods of numbness and poverty. We might think of that now as a mountaintop experience and the invariable trip down to the valley that follows. But I want you to think a minute about, can you have your cake and eat it too, or can you eat your cake and have it too? Because it's obvious physically, if you eat that cake, it's gone. You can't eat it and have it. But what in life lets you have what you want, consume what you want, and still have it available to you? What in life allows you to consume what you want and still have it available to you? Love. So physically, we can't eat our cake and still have it. You got to make a choice. But when we love another person, do we lose our ability to love? We actually increase our capacity to love, right? We can, in fact, in that sense, have our cake and eat it too. Does that make sense? Yes. You can receive grace and still have grace available too. Yes, exactly. Exactly. Because as Screwtape says, God has created us without controlling us, which some of us think might have been a bad idea. Nevertheless, God has created a creature that in some ways has more power than God, because we can do what we want, even if it's against the principles and laws of creation. Because what does God want from us, do we think? Free love, free faith, free loyalty. God wants us to want God. And God gives us the opportunity to do that or not, hence the notion of choices. So you could also think of this as contrasting happiness and joy. Happiness and joy. Happiness, the way I'm defining it, is often thought to be the satisfaction of our desires. I'm happy when North Carolina wins the basketball game, because I know everything's right with the world when that happens. I'm happy when I get the gift I wanted. I'm happy when I get the raise I deserved, right? I'm happy when my desires are satisfied. And that's not a bad thing, but it's not true happiness, is it? It's not real happiness, because what happens? The next day, you just need more. And then when you don't get it, you're unhappy. You are dependent upon something else for your well-being. You are dependent upon external circumstances for your happiness. Well, what happens with joy? Remember in C.S. Lewis's work, Surprised by Joy, he spent some time talking about this sense of just being happy to be alive. He first has it, as I remember, in looking at some toys as a child and flooding back come these memories of just being present with nature and his brother. And there's a sense of joy in just being alive. Joy perhaps being defined as letting go of our kind of preoccupations with whether we're getting what we want or not, and feeling, being, sensing that we are reconciled with the world, that at least in that moment, everything is right. In some cases, the mystical traditions refer to this as a unitive experience. And maybe you've had it in nature, whether you knew that was what you were experiencing or not. I've told you before about a moment when I was fishing out in Montana, and for whatever, if you're fishing, fly fishing in particular, you're paying very intense attention to the stream and what's there, what bugs may be on it, where the fish might be in it, looking for any movement. It's an intense focus. And I was there one day doing that, just sitting beside the stream before doing anything else, and this kingfisher just flew down the river. And there was this moment of exhilarating kind of joy. Everything just seemed to be in its place. I was just happy to be there. And then I lost it. You know why I lost it? Guess why? Why do you think? Duke won. Close. Close. Very close. Close because I started thinking about it. I put myself into the picture, just like I do when Duke wins, right? They don't care about me. But you see what I'm saying? So there's this moment. I enter into it unintentionally. I'm just trying to figure out what's going there. I lose myself in the intensity of my intentional attention. I experience this moment of grace. And then the minute I start to think, oh, this is great, it's gone. Because it depends upon my not being self-conscious. Does that make sense? Now, this is my own description of my experience. So who knows? But my sense of having had a number of those experiences is it's that self-consciousness that destroys it. It's that assertion of self that destroys it. That's a move of ego. So consistently, I think you'll see Screwtape encouraging Wormwood to stimulate ego. Put that person back in the picture. This is dangerous. If you stay open to God long enough, you might actually experience God. So get the ego to control that situation, making less space for God to be. This is a theme that comes throughout. Yeah. Ego is an acronym. I have not heard that. I like it, though. Ego is an acronym for edging God out. Edging God out. I'll come back to this. I will say that the challenge of using a term like ego is that the spiritual writers, particularly in the contemplative tradition, define it differently than psychologists do in modern psychology. So you'll hear modern psychology people will say things like, and correctly, will say things like you've got to have ego before you can lose it. But that would not be true of the spiritual tradition. So I think what the spiritual tradition is trying to say, captured effectively by the acronym, is what modern psychologists might say is egocentricity. Not just ego, not just a strength of character, but egocentricity, the notion that everything's revolving around me and everything I relate to, I do, and how it affects me. See that? One is a kind of misuse of ego. So anyway, be aware of that. I try increasingly to use control instead of ego when I'm talking about spiritual stuff. But tell me about expectation. Yeah, no, that's nice. Expectation is a marker. Yeah.
And then your expectation was, you know you had, was met beautifully. And I think what shuts it out is hyping the expectation back up again and saying, well, I see another bird, or I see what am I going to get? What I expect something.
Yes, that's nice. Thank you. The next letter, pleasures. In this letter, Screwtape advises Wormwood on how best to exploit his patient's spiritual dry period. by first trapping the man with sensual pleasures and then attacking his faith directly. Screwtape also discusses the subject of pleasure in its original pure form as designed by God, and he explains how Satan perverts pleasure and transforms it into sin. So here, as we were just discussing, there's this idea of things that are fine and good and healthy, when misused, become a problem, right? When misused becomes a problem. So Screwtape at one point says, never forget that when we are dealing with any pleasure in its healthy and normal and satisfying form, we are, in a sense, on the enemy's ground. Never forget that we are dealing with any pleasure in its pure form, its normal, satisfying form. We're, in a sense, on the enemy's ground. What do you think he means by that? Why are you on God's ground when you're dealing with a pleasure in its healthy, normal, satisfying form? Mm-hmm. God is the ultimate goal of all pleasure. Yeah. Or Augustine's ordering of desire, maybe. Yeah.
In the hymn, Come Ye That Love the Lord, there's a verse that says, religion never was designed to make our pleasure less.
Religion never was designed to make our pleasure less. And yet we have Lent. No, thank you. Right, so God created the world and said it was good, right? And we are to enjoy the world. The glory of God, Irenaeus in the 4th century says, is a human being fully alive. They didn't get fully alive because they were not enjoying their life. They're fully alive because of what? Because their pleasure is being oriented to God. So I offer as a second question, it's like, when was the last time you said something the equivalent of, I need a drink? And I don't mean to get into bad problems with alcoholism. I'm just saying, like, I need a drink, which is to say, I need to be free of this exhaustion, this annoyance, this whatever. Is that the misuse of a pleasure or the appropriate use of a pleasure? Now, let me say, what Joe's going to say is, it's a misuse unless you couple it with a cigar. Yeah. I just wanted to get that on the podcast, yeah. Misuse of a pleasure, appropriate use of a pleasure. Is that familiar to you? Do you have that feeling? How can I deal with that? Okay, yeah.
Well, it just kind of reminds me of that meme that says, here is God's proof that he loves us and wants us to be happy.
Beer is spoken like a true Trappist monk. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I think, again, can we get the awareness to stay engaged and not to use pleasures to disengage? Not allow pleasures to be obstacles to the reality that is suddenly too great for us to handle. Right? That's the challenge. So that all of those pleasures in the hands of Screwtape become dangerous because they cause us to disengage. This is a point that I thought was superb. The entire sermon was superb this morning. But when the dean is talking about the devil in the wilderness, remember he's saying devil, that word is diabolos, which can be thought of as prosecutor, but the deeper Greek etymology is to separate from. To separate from. So that the real purpose of a demon or the demonic is to separate us from God. All these other things are just tools. They're neither really good nor really bad in and of themselves. They're just tools for the demonic. I want to go one step further. Remember last week we talked about wormwood and wandering or whether he should reveal himself to the patient. Would that be helpful? And Screwtape says, well, the current policy is no. I love that. But in the next administration, maybe yes, who knows? But I want to go another step and say that what happens if you think about the devil as not being a thing or a person or even a feeling, but a way of seeing things, a perspective, an outlook, a worldview? What if the demonic, true demonic, is a way of seeing things that separates us from God? Does that make sense? That all C.S. Lewis is doing in these letters is personifying that perception as a way to let us see it. His brilliance, his innovative brilliance, is in personifying what the devil is trying to do so that we'll see that we're doing those things and know the consequences of our doing those things, i.e., make conscious choices. That's the brilliance of flipping this analysis onto the devil as opposed to just treating it in the normal moral framework that we're used to. But I want you to think about the possibility that the demonic, Satan, the devil, is a way of seeing things that separates us from God, which means it's always present. It's always luring, soliciting, tempting, because it's appealing to our egocentricity. It's appealing to our natural sense of being alive. It's almost like we have this innate sense that there's only so much being in the world, and it's all been passed out already. Everybody's got their portion of being. So if I want more, if I want to be more alive, I've got to take being from you. How do I do that? I'm more successful. I'm better looking. People like me more. Any of those things. Remember, Henry Nouwen says there are three sources of identity that get us into trouble. What other people say about us, what we've achieved, and what we possess. If we root, Nouwen says, our identity in any of those three things, we get into trouble because they're all demonic. You with me? It doesn't mean that having friends who like you is a bad thing. It doesn't mean that achievement is not something we want to encourage. It doesn't mean that possessing things is somehow evil. It does mean that if we think that's who we are and not a child of God, we're missing the boat, right? So a lot of our spiritual practices, a lot of the learning and revelation of these letters is simply alerting us to all of the ways, many pedestrian but still powerful over time, all of the ways that we drift into thinking we are those things. As if that's the only way to get more being, as if that's the way to be happy. Our desires are for those things, as if the experience of them will make us happy. When what I'm arguing is the joy of life, is about eliminating those preoccupations, which doesn't mean you have to give them up. It just means you don't accord them the power of life. And searching to be reconciled with the world, which is to be present to God. That is something we have all we need to achieve already. We already have all we need to be joyful. We don't need another thing. We don't need any more people to like us. We don't need to achieve anything else. We don't need to possess anything else, even spiritual maturity. We don't earn those things. We're given those things. They're part of the dignity of being a child of God. We have all we need to be joyful in our lives. And here's the cool part. Recognizing that allows us not to be searchers for happiness. I don't have to seek happiness. It's not coming from the outside. I can bestow happiness on others. I can bestow joy on others. Realizing that I have all I need to be joyful in life, and then living into that joy makes me able to bestow joy on others in whatever way. And the more I live into that, the more fun that is, and of course, the more likely I'm to do it, and then I do, in fact, grow in my spiritual maturity. But the key is knowing that I'm not seeking happiness. I already have everything I need. And that realization allows me to bestow joy. I'm not seeking happiness, which requires me to get it from somewhere else. I have everything I need and can bestow joy on others. Speaking of friends, in this letter, 10, Screwtape approves of Wormwood's efforts to encourage a spiritually harmful relationship that his patient has developed with a couple that is fun, bright, wealthy, and worldly. I always wanted to be that couple. This relationship will prove to be more effective if he can guide the man into leading a double life, one at church and another with his new friends. I don't know anything about this because I don't have any friends that aren't at church. We just eliminated that from our life, and it's been great ever since. All right, here's my question. Screwtape says, all mortals tend to turn into the thing they are pretending to be. All mortals tend to turn into the thing they are pretending to be, which may explain the Be Like Mike commercials with Michael Jordan. I know you were going to ask about that. So, what happens when you try to fake it till you make it? You ever heard that phrase? Yeah.
In conflict for me with talk about the undulation to make a mistake in chapter 8 or in letter 8. When I was in high school, I had a parent that gave a comment one time about, she was saying sometimes it's just hard and you have to go through the motions because sometimes you don't feel as close to God, but if you one of the bad things about the Episcopal Church in this case is that it's the same everywhere you go, and that you are in that rhythm, and if you just stay in the rhythm, that it'll come back to you essentially. And I feel like that's the biggest way to make it almost sometimes if somebody is feeling like they're straying. And so when they were talking about the undulation of in letter 8, I was thinking, oh yeah, because if they get in there when you're kind of waiting, that's the time that you're open to
Yeah. So I heard you say the Episcopal tradition, and particularly in its worship, is helpful because there's a pattern and a rhythm, and we're in it. And if we take care of it, it'll take care of us. That's what the way I've heard it phrased. With respect to the daily office, you say your prayers will say you, if you will. And how does that square with the idea of being vulnerable when you're in the trough? Yeah. Well, Screwtape says that to Wormwood, like, be careful. You're all fired up because this guy's having a hard time. And people that suffer often are less inclined to believe in God because why would God allow this suffering? But beware, because in suffering, people often find God. And when they find God in suffering, that's a more powerful God than the one they dismissed because of the suffering. I sometimes think of this as our maturation in images of God. Usually as we grow in our faith, our image of God changes, Nevertheless, I think what Screwtape is saying and what the Canon was saying in hold on to the liturgy, be patient, be available, is because not only will that carry you through and the community that's there with you, but God, you may find God is more present there than he was in the mountaintop experience. Because some of us, in the midst of a mountaintop experience, conclude that it was about us. Well, of course this is great. I won the game. But when I'm hammered, when I've been fired, when I've been left, when I'm sick, when I'm in the hospital bed. I can't save me. And sometimes in that moment, the vulnerability creates a space for God to be present, and you realize that God is with you and never left you and will always be there. And the faith that emerges out of that is a profound, deep faith, which changes your image of God and renders you less vulnerable to all those other things. That's what I would say. Does that make sense? Which is why I think Screwtape was saying to Wormwood, be careful about your excitement over this war thing, right? Because in war, clearly there must not be a God because this wouldn't be happening. The horrors of war are horrible. On the other hand, in war, we're often rendered defenseless and helpless, and it's then we discover God's presence, sometimes in another person, sometimes in something that happens. So I think that's a way to think about that anyway. Does that make some sense? Yeah. Okay. Other questions? Well, that's what happens when you take me to more interesting things. Yeah, so what about fake it till you make it? You ever done that? Does it work? Can you tell us a story about when it worked? No?
I actually don't see the evil in this. I mean, to me, if I want to live in an upright, righteous life, I wear the clothes of being upright, righteous.
Right.
Fake it till you make it. It's the way I live my whole career. I mean, I'm completely.
Yeah, so if I want to be a more compassionate person, perhaps the first thing I should do is do nice things for others, whether I want to or not. Yeah.
Morals tend to turn into what they tend to be. I absolutely do.
Yeah, so there's an example of how fake it till you make it's a helpful spiritual practice. Yes.
Yeah, I think I'm having a problem with fake it till you make it also just in when I encapsulate the idea of the power of a smile. That if you just force yourself to smile, you become more happy. I use that in life. I don't know. There's definitely, maybe it's a difference of positive emotions, faking it till you make it, and then negative emotions and dwelling in sorrow.
Yeah, so the smile is a great example of how fake it till you make it is an effective spiritual practice. Has anybody had an experience where it didn't work so well?
You can have an experience where somebody tries to fake it until they make it and they end up getting bombed. Because they didn't know what they were doing.
Right, but how about it? Yes. So there can be a downside to it, to the extent that what? It's not really you, maybe? Yeah.
Well, because they're misrepresenting themselves and
No, I understood what she said. So I'm trying to get you to go a little bit deeper. And what's the spiritual condition that caused them to misrepresent their competence? Right. So that's a material level, which is true enough, right? I come in and say, I've done this before and I hadn't, I don't know what's going on, I get fired. But what made me do that? Afraid to ask for help could be an answer. Egotism could be an answer. Another way may be afraid of being the person who can't do that. Yes. Right. Yeah. You're not your true self. It was a tool, but not getting you to the right place. Yeah. Yes.
One of the things they realized that, like, if they were truly, even though they couldn't actually fight physically, they protested morally. And it took stand, whereas a lot of people around him who profess to be Christian, when their faith was tested.
Yeah.
Even though they've gone to church, taken the sacraments, he's not faith.
Right. So it's kind of having the right objective and then having the diligence and perseverance to do it. Yeah, my sense is fake it till you make it is just a tool. It's a very effective tool because of the way we're created, from mirror neurons to the rest of the way we grow, and it's really about what you think making it is. So if you think making it is those things Henry Nouwen is identifying as problematic, faking your way there is going to leave you as an inauthentic presence. If on the other hand, it's Christ that you're faking it till you are able to imitate, you might grow up a little bit. Yeah. Dangerous to fake it, do you mean?
Creative fantasies, effective Christmas, and Norman Rockwell and all these people have this fantastic images of the perfect Christmas. And I think in reality, a lot of people are very vulnerable. We're very desperate.
Right.
So I think that if we, say that this world is a perfect thing, there are parts of it that can be good, but I think it can be good.
Right. It could be, and I think that's right. So I think what you're pointing out is that it's a little loaded because the word fake it has negative connotations, but the point is that it's really about discerning what you're trying to make. And if you're trying to make some perfection that isn't real, you're going to be left unhappy and empty. If you're trying instead to be more alive, there's a way that can be helpful. There was one other hand, maybe. Did I miss somebody over here? Yeah. Right.
Now I'm running into what I'm really doing is lying to myself. Now I just want to fake it and make it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think with a lot of things about how do we think about ourselves and how polished people are, what's the right level, that's right.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. What's the moderate point there of virtue? That's very helpful. So the next topic is laughter, which I really want to spend some time on, and I've rambled on past our time. So I'm going to pause there and come back in 2 weeks. We have Dean Willis with us next week. But I do want to get to laughter, which I think is a way of getting to the root of a lot of what we're talking about. In fact, didn't you do a lecture on laughter and faith at some point? So maybe you can explain things to us when it comes. All right. For the practice for the week quickly is, while our habitual practices can be very valuable, they can also lull us to sleep as we mindlessly say the same things over and over again. So I encourage you during the next 2 weeks to try changing some practice that you do to experience it in a different way. Change some practice that you do to experience it in a different way. For example, take the Lord's Prayer. Take the phrases of the Lord's Prayer and write them in reverse. You with me? Just write them in reverse and then say the Lord's Prayer backwards for a week or a day or once. The point is, when you do that, you can sometimes see things that are there you didn't see before, because your perspective, you often find what you're looking for, right? I once was walking out of my car and I'd lost my car keys and I couldn't figure out where they were, and I looked all around every place I thought they had been, and finally I took a spare key and I threw it into the yard. And the minute I did that, I saw the other keys that had fallen out of the things I was carrying. Because I was looking for, I don't know what I was looking for, I couldn't see them. But once I knew what a key in the yard looked like, I could automatically see the other one. I think there's some reality to that. Next time you're playing golf, try it. Just reverse those things, you'll see things in a different way. And the Lord's Prayer is an easy thing to do, but You know, if you're walking in the morning, walk a different route. I mean, just do the same things you're doing, just slightly differently, and you'll find, I think, that there's meaning there, beauty there, God there that you didn't see before because you're into doing it the same way.
And that's the theme of the bishop's meditation for this week. It's called Familiar. So if you haven't read that, I encourage you to read it. It's short and right on.
Yeah, thank you. Familiar. That does not mean that forming habits is a bad thing, right? About the last thing, a story other than my keys is when I was practicing law, I mean, now it's not such a big deal with social media, but back in the day, if you had a typo in a 25-page memo, like, you might get fired. I mean, it was a big deal. Now, you can have 5 typos in a sentence, and as long as I know what you're talking about, it's okay. But what I learned is that I couldn't proofread by reading slowly or more carefully. I had to literally read it backwards. You with me? So you had to read it backwards because only then could I see the transpositions. All I saw before was what I intended to write. So I give you these 2 very pedestrian examples so that A, you'll know I'm weird, but also to encourage you to change it up a bit. You may experience something you wouldn't have seen otherwise. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.